İyi.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Founding Director and Chairman of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, Richard Morningstar. Saygıdeğer konuklarımız, Atlantik Konseyi Global Enerji Merkezi Başkanı ve Kurucu Direktörü Sayın Richard Morningstar'ı sahneye davet ediyorum.
Well, I'd like to welcome you all here for this panel. I have to say that this is the first time in my many years that I've been introduced by the voice of God. So, you know, one more thing that I can point to. My role today is to introduce our panel, which is focused on global energy governance architecture, and also on the Atlantic Council's Energy Governance Task Force report, which was chaired by David Goldwyn, co-chaired by David Goldwyn, who unfortunately can't be with us today in Istanbul, and our moderator today, Atlantic Council Senior Fellow Philip Cornell. The report was launched in Washington, D.C. last week, and here in Istanbul today. So this is a big event, and we're certainly happy to be able to do this at this luncheon. The need to assess the state of energy governance is clear. The energy landscape is changing. Unconventional oil and gas production has upended oil market dynamics and is transforming gas markets as well. Unconventional gas production is one of the major reasons, as Fatih Birol pointed out this morning, in helping reducing emissions. Also, the costs of renewables are falling, enabling sustainable energy development, but raising questions of intermittency and grid management. And amid these shifts, the Paris Agreement established a new baseline for emissions reductions, even as alleviating energy poverty remains a top priority in many countries, and that can sometimes conflict with efforts to decarbonize. So these developments impact how we produce, consume, and trade energy. They also raise questions about the adequacy and efficacy of the current energy governance architecture, which we will be talking about today. So let me introduce our expert panel. It will be moderated again by Philip Cornell, who is the co-chair of the task force. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and really was the force behind this task force report. Prior to joining the council, Philip was a senior corporate planning advisor to the chairman and chief executive officer of Saudi Aramco, and has worked as a special advisor to the executive director of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, in Paris, and worked closely with Fatih in the days before he became the executive director. Before Philip begins, I'd like to introduce the distinguished panel and thank them for being with us today. Of course, it's my pleasure to introduce IEA Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, who I'd like to thank for providing valuable contributions and insights to our task force report. And he did that, of course, in his role as director of perhaps the best-known international energy governance institution, the IEA. And Dr. Birol has driven the IEA to take a broader role in reaching out to emerging economies and non-OECD countries and address new energy issues. I might also say that Fatih has been just an incredible supporter of the Atlantic Council and of the Global Energy Center. Most of you, I'm sure, heard his excellent presentation, or two presentations this morning, here again this afternoon, a panel tomorrow. I think that Fatih may get the award for the most valuable contributor to this year's summit. Next year, it's my pleasure. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Melanie Kenderdine, also now a recent fellow of the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and formerly the director at the Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis, and energy counselor to Secretary Moniz at the U.S. Department of Energy. There's a lot longer biography for everybody that you can read at your table. I also want to welcome Atlantic Council Senior Fellow and Energy Governance Task Force member, Neil Brown, at the far end. Neil is currently the Director of Policy and Research at the KKR Global Institute, and previously served on the senior staff of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, working with Chairman Richard Lugar, who is a major proponent of our energy policy. And Neil really is at the crossroads now of the public and private sectors in talking about these issues. And finally, but certainly by no means least, I want to introduce and welcome Dr. Ken Koyama, who's the chief economist and managing director of the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan, where he has held a variety of positions in the strategy group and World Oil and Energy Group. And I would have to say that Ken is the leading energy economist in Japan. And we're glad to welcome you again back to the Istanbul Summit and for all you've done in Washington for the Global Energy Center. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here, and I will turn it over to Philip to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I'd like to welcome everyone here to this report launch on the future of global energy governance. A couple of housekeeping notes first. This session will be on the record. It will be live streaming. Please silence your phones. Feel free to eat and make that kind of noise, but please have phones off. And you can engage in Twitter using the hashtag #ACSummit. So we're here to launch this report, which you'll have on your tables. This report came about as part of a task force that convened between October and December 2016. Now, I won't go into too many points of it. I leave you to have a look at the paper copies and also invite you to see it online. But suffice it to say that I think this report provides a bipartisan, international, and really full-throated support for the case for international engagement, particularly in the energy sphere, while at the same time recognizing the shortcomings that exist in institutional regimes today. Now, this is not about supranational regulation, but it's really about the value of setting rules of the road. The findings and the recommendations in the report see value in a sometimes decentralized and disaggregated institutional regimes, a kind of multiplicity that provides value. It also highlights the need to build and support functioning regulatory regimes at the national level. And it underscores the value to even narrowly defined and relatively parochial national interests of collaboration, common rules of the road, and leadership in international fora. So we're very honored to have today the head of what the report rightly recognizes as the premier international energy organization, the IEA, Fatih Birol. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to the rest of the panel. Fatih, the world energy economy has obviously changed a lot since 1974 and the founding of the IEA. And, you know, as you rightly pointed out this morning, it's obviously changing quite a bit in the future. The report mentions and commends a lot of the work that you've done in the past year and a half of your tenure to evolve the IEA to meet some of those challenges. So I was hoping that you might be able to tell us a little bit about what are the greatest challenges that you see facing the IEA in this changing environment from an institutional perspective. What are your plans to meet them, and really, how do you sell the IEA's capacity in this new era?
So thank you very much, Philip, and many thanks to Ambassador Morningstar for his introduction. And thank you also to you and David Goldwyn to prepare such an important and influential report. Because governance is very important. Who is governing the energy sector globally is very important. And we read your report with great interest and learn a lot in terms of the International Energy Agency. While you are enjoying your your dessert, we are going to talk here about the subject which is critical, I believe, for the global energy markets. Now, as you mentioned, Philip, International Energy Agency is the global energy authority. We are the only organization which analyzes, looks after all the energy sources: oil, gas, coal, nuclear, renewable energies, and their implications for investments, environment, and our core mission is energy security. Oil security, electricity security, and gas security. And our members are US, Canada, all European countries, Turkey being one of the founding members, Japan, Australia, Korea, and New Zealand. 29 countries, 29 nations, governments are our members. As you mentioned, I was elected 1.5 years ago as the head of this esteemed agency, which was a great honor for me and for my country. Now, I came up with a strategy which we call opening the doors of the IEA to emerging world. These 20 nations are good, well, and they are very important countries. But when we look at the trends, an energy organization without having the largest energy consumers on board may well be questioning its relevance in the future. And we call this strategy as the opening the doors of the IEA to emerging world. And this has been endorsed by our board, by our governments, by our ministers. We had a ministerial meeting in 2015, which was chaired by the Secretary Moniz of the US government, and this gave us a big endorsement. Then our board, our governing board, endorsed this, and we are fortunate enough to have Ambassador Mary Warlick here, who is one of the most active members of our governing board and the vice chair of our board. We have been endorsed. So what we have done, Philip, in 1.5 years, we have now so-called associate membership to enlarge IEA family. In 1.5 years of time, we have new members of our family: China, India, Indonesia. These 3 countries make 3 billion people. 3 billion people. Then you have Thailand, you have Singapore, and Morocco, all becoming now part of IEA family. Plus, in November, hopefully, we are having Mexico as our full member, part of the IEA. This also having Mexico part of the IEA changes a bit not only the paysage of the IEA, namely having members from Asia, Europe, and Americas, but also Mexico is a major energy producer. We talk about the OPEC and we talk about the IEA. To be honest with you, when you look at the numbers, in the last 5 years, oil production growth from IEA member countries were higher than the OPEC member countries. US, Canada, Norway, and others. So let's put the things in a context. So this is what we have been trying to do, among other things, in the IEA, open the doors of the IEA to emerging world and having them under the umbrella of the IEA. And with all those countries, we have special work programs on different issues: renewable energy, solar, wind, gas markets, emergency oil security, and among other things. And we will continue to work so in the next years to come.
Great, thank you very much. Fatih, you mentioned the value of energy security. I'd like to turn to Ken. Energy security is really at the foremost mind for policymakers, and that's certainly the case in Asia. And there's a rich history in that region of regional collaboration at an international scale. The ASEAN Summit is happening now as we speak. APEC has been dealing with energy specifically since 1990. Japan has been a linchpin member of IEA and also oil stockholder. And of course, particularly since 2011, there have been, let's say, a bumpy ride in the Japanese energy economy since Fukushima, and bigger questions about fuel switching and energy trade and nuclear safety. So how are these international regimes addressing issues of energy security in Asia? How would you say that those regimes are perceived? And if they're different than what we've seen in the past, given the rise of Asia, what does that say for what portends in the future in terms of international regimes?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Firstly, that I'd like to agree that for Asia, that the energy security challenge is very, very severe, simply because that the energy demand in the region is expected to rise substantially, and with the incremental energy demand, we are going to be more and more energy import dependent, which is a very unique phenomenon now in Asia, which is common to Japan, Korea, and even China and India. And also for our oil supply and LNG supply, we are very much dependent on supply from the Middle East. So, and also if the Middle East supply is very important, another issue is so-called sea lane security. For example, now China is 60% dependent for oil supply, of which half comes from the Middle East, 25% comes from Africa. So naturally, they need oil and LNG from Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz, Indian Ocean, Malacca Strait, and South China Sea. So naturally, that for Asia, energy security problem continue to be very important. And also, I agree with Fatih's point that traditionally we pay attention to the security of supply of oil. That's a problem. But also, we need to pay attention to the gas supply security as well as the electricity security of supply. So there's a mounting challenge for Asian countries to address these very, very difficult challenge. So with this, particularly as Fatih pointed out, that the collaboration with existing international organizations, particularly the IEA, is very important. The association of China, India, Indonesia with IEA is very, very important. But at the same time, I do believe that for Asian countries, as a region, need to embark on more effort to enhance our regional collaboration. Because if Asian big importer just individually seek for energy security, and if this was made in a kind of zero-sum game manner, that will be very damages for the energy security as a region. So I think that for China, India, ASEAN country, Japan, Korea, we need to work together. And one important possible element is, of course, for example, the stockpiling. Now China is embarking on the second and third phase of stockpiling. India is doing the same. And Japan, Korea is IEA member. And ASEAN also need to play a role for stockpiling. I understand that ASEAN plus three means that China, Japan, Korea, have a kind of oil stockpiling roadmap program. Of course, it's a state of information sharing, but I think that this kind of initiative may pave the way for the more regional cooperation together with more institutional collaboration with IEA. And another element is, for example, nuclear security. After the Fukushima, we understand to enhance the nuclear safety is a very, very important challenge for Asia, because that now it is China, it is India, it is ASEAN countries that has a very ambitious nuclear program. For enhancement of safety, of course, the individual country need to make effort, but that should be supplemented by the regional cooperation effort or other international cooperation. That's why I think that the governance mechanism is very important. The governance, as Fatih pointed out, how and who make a governance is a very important challenge. And given the fact that the center of gravity in the global energy market is shifting to Asia, that governance mechanism, including Asia, is a key element, I think.
Absolutely, and I would say also that that shift in gravity also comes with big implications for investment in infrastructure, right, which we're seeing in the region. So let's turn to that question, a bit of financing infrastructure investments and actually getting things built on the ground. We talk a little bit in the report about the potential, let's say, disconnect between, let's say, policy shops and those kind of institutions, multilateral financial institutions that might get things moving. But Neil, maybe you could talk a little bit about, from the private sector point of view, how do these kind of international organizations and international regimes facilitate greater investment?
Sure, yeah, happy to. Well, first, yeah, thank you for having me and for inviting me to join the task force. And let me just congratulate you and Dick and David for your leadership. It's a real contribution. In terms of private sector engagement, let me just put on my U.S. hat for a minute, and because there's a line of thinking in the U.S. that somehow, because of shale oil and gas, that somehow international institutions are just less relevant, or that we have less interest in certain regions. And I think that when it comes to energy governance, the U.S. leadership in shale is actually making institutions more important. Fatih this morning, I think, gave the scaffolding of why that is. I mean, one is there's a major structural shift happening in the oil markets right now. We understand how long-term conventional oil investments work. We understand how those production curves and decline rates work. Shale is something completely different. It's much shorter term investing, much steeper production and decline curves, and we don't actually know yet what those are. And this is not insignificant, right? I mean, I think, from the trough of U.S. shale, we've already brought back almost 1 million barrels a day. And that's in a very low oil price environment. So it's very important, one. And two is what Fatih mentioned this morning on volatility. OPEC no longer controls the market. Shale is the swing supplier now. And by the way, a lot of the world is still... Am I back on?
Yes, you're back on.
And a lot of the world in oil-producing countries is still in quite a volatile state. So why does that matter? Well, for U.S. shale, it's still dominated by independents. So you have a almost unprecedented reach of the oil industry into communities, into municipal tax bases, into state tax bases you just haven't had before. And so it's actually more important. In terms of investment, the one thing I would maybe have you take home is that these institutions have to evolve to be more iterative with private investment. There's sometimes with policymakers.
Neil, if we could just speak a little bit louder and into the mic. I think there's a lot of background noise.
Okay.
Yeah.
Move this. I'll come a little closer. I think there can be a assumption sometimes that the private sector simply receives policy and regulation, but almost like a manna from heaven kind of relationship. But it's just not true. In fact, the best policies when you're trying to encourage investment have to listen to the private sector, and the structures themselves should include private sector engagement. As one example that you highlighted in the report, EITI, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, it's really quite revolutionary if you think about it in terms of the government, civil society, and private sector all sitting at the same table as co-equals. So I think we need to see that more of that sort of thing. I guess to be more specific in terms of how energy governance can incent investment, I think of it in kind of three buckets, and to draw on the report to have a few examples. I mean, the first is energy governance to improve market functionality. And so essentially, how can governance structures bring about a more efficient allocation of capital? It's very basic, and it's all about information. The more information, the better. So the report highlights some areas for improvement in that regard. One big one is having much better data out of China and India, which really has quite abysmal data in my view. Second is energy governance for market creation and protection. So when we call for a strong statement of policy on free gas markets in Eastern Europe, great example of how you have to protect a market. Call for a regulatory forum. It may sound strange for a private sector guy to say, well, we want a regulatory forum, but actually having clarity. Clarity is not the same as proliferation. And to the extent that we can regularize regulations across markets, it's going to be good for investment. Third is energy governance really as a direct impetus to invest. And so this is when the institutions get very proactive, right? And so you're basically trying to shine a spotlight on an issue to bring in more investment. And this is where you need the recommendations on capacity building. I'm sure everyone here has probably been to an energy ministry in a frontier market, and you go in and there may be a few hundred people in the building, but maybe only a handful actually know anything about energy markets, and they're dealing with the entire country. And so facilitating regulations, laws on public-private partnerships, on wholesale markets, all that kind of thing is actually extremely valuable if you want to get investors involved. Certainly also instruments like risk mitigation guarantees. I mean, there's we talk in the report quite a lot about energy poverty. There's no shortage of capital to go into frontier markets. The question is the cost of capital. So to the extent that we can bring down that cost, the more money you're gonna have brought in. Last thing I would add there is, I think it's a mistake. We get caught up so many times talking about this fuel source versus that fuel source, coal versus solar, whatever it is. I think that's a mistake. I think when we think about the governance structures, I think of it as like the scaffolding that builds an investment climate. And so we should really focus on the fundamentals rather than getting caught up in a single fuel. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, and you mentioned the importance of private sector investment. Recently a lot of that has also been sort of unlocked by the role that, again, multilateral financial institutions and development banks can play in terms of leveraging networks and existing possibilities for private sector investment. Fatih, last year you launched for the first time an investment report, and you mentioned that the next one will be launched again, I think this July. But the IEA itself doesn't have any cash to invest, so you have to work with others to get that to happen. So what is the role that you see these multilateral financial institutions, for example, and international infrastructure banks playing, and how does the IEA as a policy shop complement that kind of investment work?
Thank you, Philip. Yes, you are right. We don't have cash. We have our budget, and we are trying to save our budget, even increase it a bit in the next months and years to come. And we are about 280 people in Paris. It is the budget we have. We don't invest in energy, but as the many CEOs of the major companies agree, we do influence those investment decisions substantially. We have received many thank you letters from governments, public policymakers, and investors that they were thankful to us for providing them right investment decisions on the basis of our evidence-based analysis. What we also do, Philip, is that There are some multilateral banks, such as the Asian Development Bank. It is one of the biggest banks, which makes a lot of investment in power sector, power plants, transmission efficiency. We work with them closely in order to suggest them what are the areas for investment, what will be the implication of those investments for energy security, environment, and the others. Only 2 weeks ago, I signed a major MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with the President of Asian Development Bank, so that IEA and ADB, Asian Development Bank, work together. The same with EBRD and the others. So our role is to discuss the investment opportunities with the investors, but leave the decisions to them, but to show them what are the implications of those investments for those countries and regionally and globally.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the role of the ADB. Obviously, Japan is a big backer of the ADB. But last year, we also saw the founding of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. And a lot of people are talking about whether this is a new model. A lot of the first investments happening out of the AIIB have been in cooperation with existing development banks. Do you see this as a competing model, and how do we see this in terms of affecting Asian infrastructure investment in the future?
Clearly, I think that the AIIB need to play a very important role for address the energy challenge in China and as well as other Asian countries. But one point that we need to understand is investment requirement in China and other developing Asia is so large. IEJ estimated that China alone requires over 11 trillion US dollar up to 2040, and India 5 trillion, Japan 2 trillion, and other Asian countries, and again 5 trillion for energy transition or energy transformation. So clearly, this is a huge amount of investment requirement. So to help facilitate this investment, clearly AIIB need to play a role. But again, I think that because of the uncertainty in the energy market or the need to have a more practical and functional investment enforcement, I think that the AIIB and ADB and other existing platform institutions can work together. And actually, I found that in the last years that some of the energy or infrastructure made by AIIB is in collaboration with ADB. And when I heard that from Fatih that now IEA and ADB is working together, I think it's a very promising sign how to actually mobilize and facilitating the needed large-scale investment. Clearly that under the current market environment, final investment decision of large-scale energy infrastructure is really challenged, but we need every effort starting from AIIB and ADB and IEA.
Yeah, great, thanks. Melanie, I want to leave the best, maybe to turn to last. I want to talk to you about the fun stuff, about the changing politics of international energy governance. We all know about the effects, or we've seen the effects of populism on, let's say, the perceived legitimacy of institutions writ large and of international institutions in particular. When we were doing this report on international energy governance, I was joking that President Trump maybe likes only one out of those three words. I wanted to ask you, how do you see, under the previous administration, what were some of the efforts when you were working there to improve international energy governance, and how do you see the changes since the election impacting that effort inside the U.S. government?
What I would say, Phil, is that the Trump administration, in many respects, and how it's going to approach international energy governance institutions is a little bit of a blank slate. And so I can talk a lot about what we've done, and I pulled a few quotes from officials in the Trump administration and what they have said. And I will read the quotes because I don't want to be accused of propagating fake news. And let me start by saying thanks to the Atlantic Council. I've been to this event many times, and Istanbul is, I've been to Turkey more than any other country outside of my own, and so I love coming back here, and thanks to the Atlantic Council. Fatih took all of my lines about the ministerial in November of 2015 that Secretary Moniz was the chair of. I think that was your first ministerial, wasn't it, Fatih? And Fatih mentioned the broadening of IEA with the accession country and participating countries at that event. And the Secretary Moniz was very pleased with that. But Secretary Moniz also highlighted a few things, one of them very important to Turkey, the need for diversity of energy supplies and new transit routes, a big issue there. Also, natural gas security, as Fatih mentioned, was a big issue at that IEA ministerial. I don't know, I couldn't find much about the Trump administration and their approach to IEA, and I'm just going to give a plug for Fatih because he gave one to me earlier. Secretary Perry, not at an IEA meeting, but at a G7 meeting, said this, and I quote, about a Fatih Birol presentation. We always talk about them, and so did Secretary Perry. And he said, after making some rather negative remarks about climate change, he did note that, quote, the two countries that are making real impact on emissions, and he got this from Fatih's presentation, are the US and China. On the G7, another institution that I had a lot of experience with in the Obama administration, we advanced, and they were adopted by the G7 leaders in Brussels in 2014 after the Russian incursion into Ukraine. We advanced a modern and broad set of energy security principles, transparent markets, diversity of routes and sources of supply, climate change as an energy security problem, energy efficiency as a need for focus on energy efficiency in order to assist energy security, innovation R&D, important. I'll say a little bit about that in a second, and what the Trump administration has done with that, and emergency response. At the G7 energy meeting in Italy in 2017, Secretary Perry said, quote, it's wise for countries to use high efficiency energy resources, low emissions coal and gas with adequate financing for multilateral development banks, end quote. And I would say that I could see a big difference between what he was advancing at G7 and the Obama administration, where I think most of you know that our policy for the lending institutions, multilateral lending institutions, was for financing of coal plants only if they had CCS, except in very rare instances, so you're seeing a change there. The G20, Brisbane 2014, President Obama and China announced their agreement on climate. In 2016, when China was the president, the finance ministers at the G20 meeting called for all countries to implement the Paris commitment and their financial commitments. And then in 2017, under the Trump administration, climate change was dropped from the draft. It's my understanding that was at the urging of both the Saudis and the US. And also for the first time, the world's largest economies at the G20 dropped their long-standing endorsement of free trade at the urging of the United States. That disappeared from the communique. I think that portends a lot to come as well. That was done, as I said, at the urging of the US, and pulling out of TPP, the demise of TTIP in this administration. I did have in my talking points yesterday that there was a memo on President Trump's desk reported in the press to get to end NAFTA, but I understand today that they are going to keep NAFTA. So that was a quick change. And I'm going to close with two things that we worked on. The Clean Energy Ministerial, that's 24 countries, and they support best practices and promote policies to scale deployment of clean energy technologies. The Ministerial for CEM, that is DOE run in the US government. The Ministerial is in China this year, June 6th to the 8th. And the Secretariat, fortunately for CEM, is now wisely located at IEA. I could find nothing in the press on what the Trump administration will do with SEM. It's my understanding that Secretary Perry will likely go, but that's not confirmed. I don't know that yet. And related to that is mission innovation. That is 22 countries and the EU, and they committed to doubling federal clean energy R&D investments over a 5-year period. Importantly, let me read you the 2016 baseline numbers that we developed. That was announced in Paris, 2015. These are the baseline numbers that we all fought and argued, and everyone tried to lowball their baselines at some point. And these are the baselines we developed, 2016. So by 2021, these would be doubled. This was the agreement of these countries and the EU. The US was 6.4 billion, China was 3.8 billion, and Europe, including the EU and the other countries of Europe, combined was 2.05 billion. The Trump skinny budget that they put out on March 18th, I believe, suggests that there's going to be a 45% cut in clean energy R&D. So if that number is held constant over the next 5 years, in 2021, China will be at $7.6 billion federal investment in clean energy R&D. Europe will be at $4.1 billion, and the US will be at $2.88 billion. So we will be third in that group, and those are the three largest groups. And if I could just say, that to me is coming from the Department of Energy and knowing how important it is to our intellectual pipeline in the United States and our global competitiveness in a market where 195 countries have committed at Paris to a clean energy future, reducing that investment, and we will lose our competitive edge and lose our differentiator, which is our university system and our investment and starve key disciplines in a clean energy future. And so anyway, those are just a few comparisons that I see.
Thanks very much, Melanie. Your point about sort of the pipeline of investment is very well taken, but also your point about how there seemed to be sort of a dearth of messages, and sometimes mixed messages, coming out of this administration. It can sometimes feel a little bit like playing Kremlinology. I mean, who's on the ascent, who's on the outs? I mean, it seems now that some of the more sort of apocalyptic, apocalyptic isolationist elements are on the way out. And if we're going to talk about quotes, and we're talking about multilateralism, Trump just told the AP, the president told the AP yesterday, that he thought NATO was obsolete because he didn't know anything about it at the time, but now that he knows more, he sees value in it. Neil, you were working inside on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and also in Senator Richard Lugar's office. Now, is that the right way to look at these things, or is there a better perspective?
Well, I mean, I think it's a sign of strength that when somebody can stand up and say they don't know something, and so at least he learned. Maybe to pick up on the budget point that Melanie was talking about, and listen, I agree in the importance of R&D spending. I think most Republicans join me. I also agree that a budget is a powerful messaging document, but I remember when, for the I don't know, I guess almost 9 years I was working on Capitol Hill, and budget day would come, and you know, it'd arrive, a big thick book, and you'd sort of say, well, thanks for the doorstop. Now Congress will write the budget. So I wouldn't get too caught up on numbers, but you know that well, because you were you were advocating a number of very, very good programs that I'm glad we were able to pass on a bipartisan basis. I think in context, I'll come to Trump, but let's just remember that the challenge to institutions is not contained to the United States. If you think about China wanting to shape IMF, other international institutions to have more of a voice, rightly so, given its place in the world, that's a challenge as well. You think about the political volatility across Europe. Pretty positive result in the first round of the French elections, but remember that you had 4 candidates going into that primary, into that first round, all of which were polling about the same and had completely different views. It could have gone any way. I mean, there's a lot of volatility, Brexit, et cetera. So I think it's important to put the challenge in that context. When it comes to President Trump, I mean, we have no idea what the White House thinks of the IEA or these other international institutions. There's reason to think that there would be met with some critical eye in the White House, as have most international institutions. But there's a huge amount of unpredictability. But what we do know is that despite a lot of the rhetoric, and NATO's a great example, that on most policy areas you're actually there's kind of a normalization. First, there was taking a phone call from the Taiwanese president, but then one China is back, and first NATO is obsolete, and now it actually needs to be stronger than ever. I think that's more of the norm than the exception. But of course, there are some big exceptions, and trade, of course, one of them, immigration, another. But I think that there's no reason to think that support for international energy governance would be any different from that norm. So that's one. 2 is appointees matter. The president is only as good as the people he and someday she surrounds themselves with. Melanie's a good example of that, quality staffing. The fact of the matter is the Secretary of State was the CEO of the largest oil company in the world. Agree with him or not on certain policy positions that he took as CEO of Exxon, the fact is he understands international energy governance and understands its importance. Likewise, the National Security Council has very good staffing in this area. The rest of the team is still being filled out. I hope there's a new Assistant Secretary for Energy at the State Department very soon. We need that. We need that in this region in particular, and we'll talk about that later today. The third is, the administration is building a record on energy. Now, its first focus is domestic, and it's focusing first on regulations. There's an explicit acknowledgement. Rules of the road matter. They matter in the U.S., they matter internationally. And it's not that they're just taking everything away. A number of those rules they're trying to fix, at least fix in how they perceive them. And fourth is, if nothing else, the administration forces a re-examination of institutions and of policy positions. And you may or may not agree with the rhetoric that gets you to that point, but inertia is a really bad reason to keep something around. And so if you can take this opportunity, as Fatih is doing it with his leadership in the IEA, say, okay, let's look at this thing. How can it be improved to meet the challenges of tomorrow? And by the way, it's not just changing oil markets. It's complete transformation of renewables markets. It's digitization that's changing every industry. Energy is one of them. And so I think that this actually can be a good opportunity, and the United States, whether it's under the Trump administration or whoever comes next, will continue to be a good part of that.
Right. Thanks. And I'll ask one more quick follow-up to Fatih before we turn to the Q&A. Fatih, Melanie mentioned that you were quoted by Secretary Perry. That was in the context of discussing Washington's future approach to the Paris Agreement. Obviously, a lot of the forecasts that come out of the IEA are based on policy assumptions around climate policy as much as anything else. When you look around the world now, what are your assumptions about policy going forward, particularly in the area of the Paris Agreement and climate? Globally.
Thank you. I think what Melody said, the Secretary Perry quoted our numbers or my speech during the G7 Leaders Summit. What I was telling is what I said here as well this morning, that the United States is at the forefront of reducing CO2 emissions, mainly because of shale gas replacing coal, and the renewables are making major inroads. This was a data, and I think it is important to note for everybody. Now, for the future, we have our base scenario, which looks at the policies which are in place, where the world goes to. But what the countries are doing now is not enough to reach the target which was set in Paris, to have a 2 degrees trajectory. Therefore, many, many efforts need to be made to go there, and without making any comment whether or not the countries would fulfill their obligations in Paris or not, we say what needs to be done for gas, renewables, efficiency, and nuclear. We look at that, and we are very much looking forward to have a much clearer picture in terms of global climate engagement of key countries in the world.
Thanks very much. Okay, so now I think what we'd like to do is open it to the floor. We have roving mics. I see one here, General Clark. If we could, and if you could please just say your name, your affiliated institution, and then your question. Thank you.
So my question has to do with energy security and the relationship between energy security and price. So where we are in the oil markets right now is that when the price gets too low, big projects get deferred and unconventional oil shuts down. When the price is high, unconventional oil floods the market because, as one of the panelists was saying, it's a great short-term investment. You can double your money in 12 months, et cetera. So it looks to me like as you project ahead, you're in for a future period of a great deal of uncertainty and volatility in energy security, both in terms of quantity available and price. And that has its own effects worldwide on consumer countries and producing countries. So what's the thinking of the IAEA about the responsibility as you broaden out the organization and recognize that it's not just producers against consumers, but there are mixes here that are important. What's your thinking about price stability? Would you ever entertain an IAE goal of aiming for a certain price stability, say $55 or $60 a barrel as a market clearing price that wouldn't excite too much additional unwanted investment?
This is a great question. I mean, we discuss a bit in the report the value of price stability and the political imperative to do that. Fatih, he mentioned, he asked about the IEA in particular.
Yeah. No, I think General Clark is perfectly right. There is a strong relationship with the level of price and investment there for the oil production. Now, perhaps I can make 3 remarks here. First, we as the International Energy Agency, we don't intervene the price. Price is and needs to be set by the markets, I believe. Second, if the prices go too low, which we have experienced in the past, a few years ago, or in fact 2 years ago, it has an implication for investments, and the oil security could be a major issue. And when you put this low oil investments, plus some of the geopolitical uncertainties in key producing countries in Middle East or in Venezuela in Latin America, oil security remains a major issue, a major concern for us. It's number 2. Number 3, at the IEA, we have stocks. To be a member of the IEA, you need to have 90 days of stocks, and in case of an emergency, but real emergency, such as the Iran-Iraq war or the Katrina, the Hurricane Katrina, we release stocks in order to calm the markets as an insurance for the markets, our major role. On top of that, we were, some of you may remember, IEA was founded by Henry Kissinger as a reaction to the first oil shock. And at that time, IEA countries' share in the global energy, global oil consumption was over 70%, 1974. And now it is less than 50%. So therefore, it was exactly the time that we need to open our doors to new oil importing countries, such as China, such as India, and the others, in order to enhance the global energy security. And it is one of the reasons why we started 1.5 years ago, opening the doors of the IEA, emerging countries, in order to contribute to global oil security.
Can I say?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, something on that. General Clark, the U.S. law, there's always been oil price volatility. So for many, many years, it's not unusual just because we're producing unconventional oil and it might be higher priced oil. That doesn't diminish the fact that there has always been oil price volatility. U.S. law does not allow us to use our strategic petroleum reserves to respond to oil prices. We can only use those for supply disruptions or imminent supply disruptions. And in the imminent supply disruption or anticipated supply disruption, we have limits on the numbers of barrels that we can put into the marketplace. So our own law would prohibit us from doing that. I don't think you would be able to change our law to allow us to manipulate price or respond to price. I think that would be extremely hard to do. And so I did read your report, Phil, while I was on the plane, sitting in front of you, not reading it because I didn't know you. I wasn't doing it for show. I was actually reading it and was curious as to what you all meant when you said we needed to do more with our reserves and that authority. But we can't do that under U.S. law right now.
Phil, just to add, I mean, I would be against any policy that tried to set prices. One, it's not possible, but two, there's no reason to think the government could do it very well at all, even if it was possible. But I think we can, though, get more efficient markets that will level out the volatility, and you do that three ways. One is better data. The IEA is at the forefront of data, but it can do better just like every other institution. I mean, one is, I mean, the market just accepts this data from OPEC, which is just crazy. I mean, like, their production estimates and et cetera are just not credible. But I think more to the point is the energy markets haven't yet really adopted modern technology to be able to have real-time data reporting. So, oil markets are responding to data revisions that are a week, a month, several months old. It makes no sense. So one is data. Two is we need to update our emergency stocks. The U.S. stocks, we need to have China and India coordinated. The market should know that there is a credible cushion. I don't think that there is a credible cushion today. And three is that we need alternatives. Oil is a monopoly over the transportation sector. General, you know that better than anybody. You're a great advocate of alternative fuels. We have to have more alternative fuels. You get that through research, but you also get it through price increases to have the market step in. And so I think that the market will correct itself. We can just make the market more efficient.
Ken, please.
Very briefly, that I also would like to echo that the well-functioning market is a key element of security. And of course, that in the marketplace, that the price volatility is, it is very difficult to avoid. But one thing as an insurance policy, that the stockpiling is important, but also I do believe that the information sharing of the market information is very, very critical to avoid that the panic behavior or panic response, which can deteriorate the market situation.
Absolutely, and I'll say in the report, that's precisely, I think, one of the things that we highlight is the good work, for example, at the IEA in terms of making data transparent, and also the work in terms of price formation analysis that you do in cooperation with OPEC, the IEF, and I think IOSCO since many years. Maybe we can take one, are there any more questions that we have for the panel? Okay. Okay, in that case, I mean, we're running to the end of the time anyway. Let me just say that the next session begins here at 2:45 p.m. entitled Boosting Regional Energy Partnerships and Trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. Please remember to wear your credentials, and for the latest agenda, have a look at the app AC Summit, which is available from the App Store. I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for taking part in that conversation today. And we can give them a round of applause. Thank you.